Welcome to Gardening with DC. In today's seed series video, we're going to have a quick look at potting mixes. Now, a question I get asked from time to time by clients is, what potting mix should I buy? And I understand why this gets asked, because there is a quite bewildering array of potting mixes available if you go to your local garden centre. There can be a huge variation in price, and it can be a little bit confusing because some things are called soils, some things are called potting mixes, other things are manures, etc, etc, etc. And compounding all of that is the fact that obviously these products come in a sealed bag. So you often can't look, you can't smell, you can't touch what you are buying. Now, potting mixes or soils more broadly really are incredibly important. A nice example to illustrate this is the First Fleeters. Now, I wasn't there, so I don't know this with any great certainty, because I think the stories do suggest that there is perhaps a little bit of an absence of technical skill on the ground as well. However, really the main reason that their first crops failed in Sydney Cove, modern day Circular Quay, if you like, is the poorness of the soil. And it wasn't in fact until the time that they moved further up the Parramatta River, up to Rose Hill specifically, that they got much better success with their crops, because suddenly they had much better soil. An interesting part of that story as well is the fact that there was a very small herd of cattle on that first fleet, and they immediately took off because the soils were so poor in Circular Quay that the grass was dreadful. So they took off, and they were rediscovered, I think it was around about 8 years later, in cow pastures, modern day Camden, and that herd, which I think was 4 from recollection, was something like 104 or something like that now. So, and they were quite happy there in cow pastures because obviously the soil was much better, therefore producing much better grass for them to eat. So soils really are incredibly important. Now, what do we want our soils to do? What were the soils doing well in Rose Hill and cow pastures as opposed to Circular Quay? Well, 2 things really. Soils are all about holding and providing. Slight asterisks on that hold. So what do we want them to do? Well, we want them to hold and provide nutrition, water and oxygen. Okay, so nutrition, water and oxygen. Now, the reason that I say there's a slight caveat on the hold is because we don't want them to hold too much. What we want to see occur is that when there is an excess, that excess is allowed to escape, to go away. So if we think about this in the context of what soils are composed of, we see what that means. Now, soils generally, gardeners think of them in a sort of a slightly linear way. On one hand, we have potentially very sandy soils. On the other hand, at the other end of that spectrum, we have potentially very clayey soils. So if you have a very sandy soil, what happens is we've got potentially very good drainage, but that sand is not very good at holding particularly water and particularly nutrients. On the other end of that scale, clay, well, that's terrific, particularly at holding water, but probably too good. So in between that, we've got sands, we've got silts, we've got organic matter, we've got a whole variety of different things. Now, the important thing is that if we've got really good soil, it's generally a mixture of all of those things, as opposed to just one in particular. And that's where we sort of get into a bit of trouble. If our soil is too sandy, it's problematic. If it's too clay, that's problematic. If it's just full of organic material, well, that's problematic as well. So we really need a mixture. And that's part of the reason that potting mix is called, well, potting mix, because it should be a mix of stuff, right? Now, One way we can test it, and if you wanted to pop out in your own garden or perhaps test some of the soil in pots that you have, is a really simple test. Is you just sort of scoop up a bit of a handful and then you try and roll it into a ball. Now if you can't get any sort of structure at all and everything just crumbles away, well, it's probably a really sandy soil. If you're able to roll it together and then go boom and have the perfect ball, it's probably too clay. What we want is just a little bit of structure when we do that. So not so it's flying all away and not so that we get a perfect ball, but just a little bit of structure. Okay, so that's what we're looking for, and that's if you were to say compare a really sort of super cheap potting mix and perhaps one a bit more expensive, and you're doing that test, you'd see some of that result. One might be quite crumbly and just fall away, the other one might just have a bit more structure. So that's what's going on, and as I say, that's a good way for you to test your own soil. And if you found it to be too sandy or too clayey, well, generally you can add a bit of organic material and a few other bits and bobs and get a balance back where you want it to be. Now, as well as having that better mix in terms of those more expensive potting mixes, what you often find as well is that they will have added nutrition, possibly some wetting agents. You know, particularly here in Sydney, it's important that we have those wetting agents, particularly in pots, and you might have trace elements as well, which are just elements, minerals, if you like, that plants just need in very sort of fine and small amounts to help their cellular structures. So if you can, certainly my recommendation would be to spend a bit more on potting mix wherever you can, or of course, because gardening is all about trying new things, it's all about learning, is make up your own potting mix. Get possibly a cheaper one, but then add some compost, add some manure, add other bits and bobs, and use it as a learning experience. Of course, be mindful of what plant you're going to be putting in there, and if your plant does need sort of very particular needs, then maybe go for a specialist mix. Anyway, I hope that that's been helpful, and as I say, it's all about learning, it's all about trying new things, so get out there and give it a go.